Be empty, that is all. The perfect man uses his mind like a mirror, going after nothing, welcoming nothing, responding but not storing. Therefore, he can win out over things and not hurt himself. How should I live my life in a world where everything around me seems out of control? Which of the alternate paths should I take as my guide? Why is it that I come to choose one course over another, and how do I choose a path? Because there are many different ways to see the same thing. Why do I, and why should I, see things the way I do, and not another way? Questions that Zhuangzi faced are indeed among the most fundamental human problems, and something that we have been attempting to find the answer for thousands of years. In this lecture, and in future lectures, we will attempt to tackle these questions by studying a bit further on Zhuangzi, whom we have briefly mentioned in the last video, and someone who, among many other great philosophers that have mostly been ignored by the Western audience. We will do so by analyzing some of his logical reasoning processes a bit further and what answers he arrived at. However, to understand his reasoning and his answers, we must first understand his life's context and the environment of his life in which he grew up, as well as the important information about the book Zhuangzi, which we will be doing deeper analysis in later videos. We must also clarify some misconceptions that people have with Zhuangzi and Daoism because of misinterpretations of loosely translated concepts, or because the speakers that people hear from simply did not study enough that they are not aware of the biases of the translators and interpreters. Although Zhuangzi's Daoism is in many ways different from that expounded in the Tao Te Ching, and his book is considered as the most important of all the Taoist writings, and acclaimed to be more comprehensive than Tao Te Ching, Zhuangzi is less known by Western non-scholars than Tao Te Ching. However, his role in shaping Chinese history and culture cannot be overstated, for his philosophy of the usefulness of the uselessness and philosophy of life has given mental solace many intellectuals in Chinese history. Every major Chinese writer or poet in history was deeply imbued with the ideas and artistry of the Zhuangzi. His approach to life has also had a profound influence on Chinese landscape painting, and the messages in the book played a pivotal role in assimilating Buddhism into Chinese culture after it was first brought over to China from India in the 1st century CE. Like many other philosophers before the Common Era and their works, we know very little about Zhuangzi except that he lived in the state of Song from the period of 399 BCE to 295 BCE. Regardless of the exact details of his life, what we can gather from his life is that, like many other classical Chinese philosophers, he lived during a time of great social instability, when warfare was constant, and famine and death were everyday events. During this period, it was easily possible to receive harsh and unreasonable punishments from tyrannical kings based solely on their whims. Zhuangzi expressed his philosophical thinking through fables, fairy tales, or stories that are mostly fantastic and fanciful. Yet, these examples often included stories of those whose limbs were cut off and whose foreheads were branded. Because of how difficult it was just to live out one's natural years without harm, there was a heavy, serious, and war-oriented side to his stories behind his joking and comedic tone that can be seen on its face value. Therefore, our important job as readers and learners of the Zhuangzi is to capture the whole picture of Zhuangzi's philosophical outlook and to reorganize his different strands into a coherent theory, and not just a simple self-help version of his philosophy. Before we move forward on taking a closer look at his ideas, as serious readers and learners, we must first understand the nature of the work of the Zhuangzi. In the complete works collected in the Zhuangzi, there are 33 chapters. The first 7 are identified as the inner chapters, while the next 15 chapters are classified as the outer chapters, and the remaining 11 are assorted as the miscellaneous chapters. The consensus among the philosophers and the scholars is that the inner chapters were written by Zhuangzi, while the outer chapters were written by his followers. The miscellaneous chapters are considered as not affiliated with him or his followers, and thus often discredited, while some commentators claim that several passages could also be attributed to Zhuangzi. Because of his loquacity and his lightheartedness, it is not clear to the readers which of his comments are serious and which are meant for ironies. Therefore, the Zhuangzi is subjected to a wide array of opposing interpretations, with each interpreter citing sufficient texts for their claim. As Li Yirley, professor at the Stanford University, puts it, few books existing anywhere are both as compelling and as mysterious as is the Zhuangzi. It simultaneously draws one's attention and eludes one's grasp. Or, as Chet Hansen, chair professor at the University of Hong Kong, poetically described, Zhuangzi has a unique philosophical style. He wrote philosophical fantasy. This style injects insecurity into interpreters, yet it attracts us like philosophical honey. His combination of brilliance and elusive statements frustrates, delights, and challenges those who want to interpret it. However, some hold quite a pessimistic view of the work of Zhuangzi. Arthur David Whaley, an English Orientalist and sinologist who achieved both popular and scholarly acclaim for his translations of Chinese and Japanese poetry, remarks that translations of the Zhuangzi often tend to be translations of the commentaries rather than of the text, because the text itself is so corrupt as to be frequently quiet and unintelligible. Therefore, whenever we hear someone talking about Daoism, whether it would be about Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi, we must be cautious as to what type of information they're presenting and how much of their information is biased toward a particular interpreter or a translator. We must also wonder whose translations are they reading. Most importantly, we must question how much of an incomplete picture that they're presenting, and we must do our due diligence to keep that in mind whenever someone presents us with information in an authoritative tone. Despite many interpretations and translations, because the issues that Zhuangzi dealt with are germane to the interests of Western philosophers, he has been a favorite subject for comparative philosophy. For example, on being and identity, he has been compared, among others, to Aristotle, on the philosophy of life and culture to Nietzsche, on world-making to Wittgenstein, on radical concrete particularity to Heidegger, on the deconstructionist view of language, and on skepticism of language to Derrida, on the issues of meaning, truth, and reality to Putnam, on anti-representationalism and pluralism to Rorty, and on skepticism to Sextus Empiricus and Theaetetus. Zhuangzi's primary response to our fundamental human question is this: they can never be answered in the terms in which they have been put forward, because we simply don't know why our consciousness sees things in one way or the other, and so can never ultimately ground its own judgments, and is actually in no position to serve as a guide for living. He illustrates his position on the argument for the relativity of judgment as: there is nothing in the world bigger than the tip of an autumn hair, and Mount Tai is little. No one has lived longer than a dead child, and Pengzu died young. In other words, we may think the tip of an autumn hair may be extremely tiny, but from the perspective of an ant, it will judge the tip of a hair as fairly large because of its small size. Mount Tai, one of the most famous mountains in China, is indeed large, but from a being who may be bigger than mountains, it will judge the mountain to be quite small. Similarly, from a fly's point of view, the child who died prematurely lived a long life, but from an angel's point of view, even a human who lived for 800 years, such as Pengzi, who supposedly lived for over 800 years, died young. Thus, the way our concepts categorize the world does not indicate any genuine categories among the natural order. It must be noted that Zhuangzi did not deny the possibility of genuine comparison and actual differences. Currently, we compare the alternatives and we choose what is the best possible alternative out of all the hands that we have been dealt with, and then deliberately follow the path that we have decided on. This is what he claims is the fundamental structure of all purposive activity and conscious knowledge, the basis of all ethics, all philosophy, all politics, all of human achievement. However, Zhuangzi considered this path as ridiculous and impossible because to him, our knowledge, our intuition, our will is unreliable. Tradition, our logic, and our faith are all unreliable. So he asked, what else is there? To have people realize the meaninglessness of conventional values and to free ourselves from our bondage. Zhuangzi utilized different rhetorical methods, such as paradoxical anecdotes or pseudological discussion that challenges our conventional system of values, but also on the conventional concepts of time, space, reality, and causation. By often using non sequitur in his work, he aims to make us aware of the truth outside the ordinary logic, something that many Western readers of Chinese and Japanese Zen literature are aware of. The other method he often also uses is pseudological discussion that sounds rational or reasonable, but slowly turns into nonsense by reducing language to gibbering insanity. Instead, he proposes to us to appear useless. Zhuangzi suggests that if an individual seems like he has no knowledge, talent, or virtue, then he will not be called upon to serve the king. To seem useless is to hide one's brilliance, so one is able to avoid drawing attention from others and avoid attracting followers. In a perilous war where wars were constantly waged and men die young, being useless is a means of self-preservation and one of the ways to accomplish one's own grandeur. He explains this by analogizing ourselves to that of trees. The cinnamon can be eaten, so it gets cut down. That lacquer tree can be used, so it gets hacked apart. All men know the use of the useful, but nobody knows the use of the useless. In his view, a man who is free from conventional standards of judgment will no longer suffer, for he does not recognize poverty as any less desirable than affluence, or death as any less desirable than life. His proposal clearly stands in contrast to what many people call the art of not trying. He does not advocate in any literal sense for people to withdraw and hide from the world. Doing so only means that he was still going out of his way to pass judgment on the world and taking action. Instead, what he proposes was for us to remain within society, but avoids acting out of the motives that would lead common men to struggle for wealth, fame, success, or safety. He calls the state of maintaining autonomy as Wu Wei, or non-volitional action. In other words, the art of not forcing. This concept is not about a forced quietude, but rather a course of action that is not established upon purposeful motives of gain or striving. When we are in the state of Wu Wei, all human actions become genuine and mindless as those of the natural world. Man becomes one with nature and joins the Tao. To describe this mindless, purposeless mode of life, we will end today's lecture with analogies of the artist or craftsman, which Zhuangzi most often employed to describe this mindless, purposeless mode of action. A butcher was cutting up an ox for Lord Wu Wei. Wherever his hand touched, wherever his shoulder leaned, wherever his foot stepped, wherever his knees pushed, with a zip, with a whoosh, he handled his chopper with a plume, never skipped a beat. He moved in time to the dance of the mulberry forest and harmonized with the head of the line symphony. Lord Wu Wei said, "Ah, excellent! That technique can reach such heights." The butcher then sheathed his chopper and responded, "What your servant values are the way, which goes beyond technique. When I first began cutting up oxen, I did not see anything but oxen. 3 years later, I couldn't see the whole ox. And now, I encounter them with spirit, and don't look with my eyes. Sensible knowledge stops, and spiritual desires proceed. I rely on the heavenly patterns, strike in the big gaps, and guided by the large fissures, and follow what is inherently so. I never touch a ligament or tendon, much less do any heavy wrenching."